What's up, y'all? My name is Ray. If you're here for the first time, welcome. And to my returning viewers, I am humbled to welcome you back to the channel for another video. If you guys haven't subscribed yet, please do. It's awesome. You'll make my day. So, a couple of weeks ago, I made a video about the American conservative academic Thomas Sowell, reviewing some of his quotes and assertions and calling him out for what I considered to be intellectual dishonesty. The video received mixed reviews, but I am happy to say that it did elicit a bit of what I would consider constructive discussion, or at least there was a handful of comments that I thought, hey, well, we might disagree, but I can see where you're coming from. I can empathize with your point of view, and I don't begrudge you for having an opinion I would preferably change. And to me, I'd say that's a win, so it made sense to do a follow up. Now, real quick, for first time viewers, who is Thomas Sowell? He's an American conservative author, economist, and political theorist, considered one of the preeminent Black voices in conservative American political discourse today. He's someone whose name and quotes are evoked quite often in right wing circles when talking about things like income inequality and racism. People like Ben Shapiro and Candace Owens wish he was young enough to run for president. He's that kind of a guy. I go into more detail about him personally in my previous video. Please check that out if you haven't, but suffice to say, I am not a fan. That said, I must again provide the following disclaimer. I am not here to call Thomas Sowell stupid or to disrespect the man's career credentials, anything like that. But again, I'm not letting him off the hook just because he has a long resume. Now, one of the recurring sentiments in the pro Sowell comments on my last video was the suggestion that I hadn't yet consumed enough of Sowell's work. That if I read some more, maybe I would be more inclined to see things from his point of view, which, sure, fair enough. He's been writing books longer than I've been alive. And I didn't know what kind of video I'd do next, so I thought about it for a while and figured, why not do a book review? Which, of course, then begged the question of which of his books to choose. I knew I wanted to do something recent. I also knew I'd probably read too much of Intellectuals and Society already. So, long story short, I decided to go with his 2018 work, Discrimination and Disparities. Let's jump right in. The book is divided into 5 or 7 chapters, depending on which edition you read. The original print, ebook, and the Audible version are 5 chapters. The revised version and the currently available Kindle edition are 7 chapters. Rather annoyingly, I was already well into my notes for this video before my print edition arrived, and I discovered it was different than what I'd listened to and downloaded. Longer story longer, my review will contain quotes and references from both the 5 and 7 chapter versions, as I've now read both, and my final thoughts will pertain to the project as a whole rather than to focus on one specific edition. For the purposes of our outline, we'll use the original 5 chapter edition, broken down as follows. Chapter 1, Disparities and Prerequisites. Chapter 2, Discrimination, Meanings and Costs. Chapter 3, Sorting and Unsorting People. Chapter 4, The World of Numbers. Chapter 5, Social Visions and Human Consequences. As Sowell intended, we'll start at the beginning with Chapter 1, Disparities and Prerequisites. This is, of course, an introductory chapter, and it did feel like it, especially at first. His premise throughout the chapter is that countless variables are at play with regard to almost any eventual outcome in a complex system, whether it's an individual life or a whole society. It feels a bit labored, in my opinion, lots of common sense and trivia knowledge, but there are some really thought-provoking examples too, from the IQ distribution of siblings and twins to the biodiversity of Peruvian trees. Sowell doesn't outright state his present-day agenda just yet, but he lays the ideological groundwork with, quote, "The idea that the world would be a level playing field if it were not for discrimination is a preconception in defiance of both logic and facts. Nothing is easier to find than sins among human beings, but to automatically make those sins the sole or even primary cause of different outcomes among different peoples is to ignore many other reasons for those disparities," unquote. This feels a bit like a straw man argument to me, with some naive idealist proclaiming that the socioeconomic fortunes of every person on the planet were the sole result of discrimination, rather than a wildly complex combination of factors, one of which might very well be discrimination. To exclusively argue with the former feels like ignoring the existence of and obvious logical superiority of the latter. All in all, I didn't feel like I got much out of the chapter aside from some new Jeopardy clue fodder, but it wasn't bad by any means. Plenty of thought provoking factoids and such. All right, chapter 2, Meanings and Costs. Now we're getting into the thick of things. First, Sowell divides the concept of discrimination into two forms, discrimination 1 and discrimination 2. Sowell states, quote, an ability to discern differences in the qualities of people and things, and choosing accordingly, can be called discrimination 1, making fact based distinctions. The narrower but more commonly used meaning, treating people negatively based on arbitrary assumptions or aversions concerning individuals of a particular race or sex, for example, can be called discrimination 2, the kind of discrimination that has led to anti discrimination laws and policies. Ideally, discrimination 1 applied to people would mean judging each person as an individual, regardless of what group that person is a part of. But here, as in other contexts, the ideal is seldom found among human beings in the real world, even among people who espouse that ideal. And that's where Sowell decides to split discrimination 1 into 1A and 1B, with 1A representing the ideal of judging everyone individually, regardless of what demographic group they belong to, and 1B representing discrimination based on statistical group factors, such as choosing to not even interview a black person because they have a higher chance of failing a background check, which is, of course, where things start to get ugly. We'll generally be referring to race-based discrimination too throughout this discussion, which, as Professor Jennifer Doliak of Texas A&M University puts it, quote, is what economists refer to as taste-based discrimination or animus. It occurs when decision makers care about race itself, not race as a proxy for something else, unquote. Sowell frames the question of discerning which type of discrimination, 1 or 2, is at play in any given situation as follows. Quote, are group disparities in outcomes a result of internal differences in behavior and capabilities accurately assessed by outsiders, or are those disparities due to external impositions based on the biased misjudgments or antagonisms of outsiders? Unquote. Sowell's primary argument in the latter half of Chapter 2 is that discrimination 2 in particular incurs such a cost on the decision maker that, in a free enough market setting, he is essentially driven out of the marketplace. So rather than try to address inequality through social programs or government intervention, most discrimination would resolve itself through market forces, making the act of being an outright racist an untenable position for success. Sowell, in fact, goes even further to suggest that a number of social programs, most notably the minimum wage, have not only failed to help marginalized groups, particularly young black men in Sowell's example, but have been counterproductive and ultimately harmful to the communities they've intended to help. So, what are my takeaways from Chapter 2? Well, positively, I'm coming away with a more nuanced understanding of discrimination, particularly the tricky distinction between discrimination 1B and 2. Negatively, well, it's very clear what agenda is at play throughout this chapter. He brings some very specific examples and extrapolates from them that essentially any intervention beyond the free market will be counterproductive, and more controversially, that bad actors among the lower classes are more responsible for negative socioeconomic outcomes than type 2 discrimination. Basically, he gives us a rock solid framework for discussing discrimination, but then proceeds to manipulate us with carefully curated statistics which tell a very specific story. By the end of the chapter, I had begun to consider that Sowell's rhetoric was more classist than racist, like I'd previously thought. Next, we have Chapter 3, Sorting and Unsorting People. In this chapter, Sowell provides a number of examples of what he refers to as people sorting themselves, mostly with regard to immigration and settlement patterns. Birds of a feather flock together, that kind of thing. He then explains his opinion that almost any outside actions which seek to unsort those people, such as affirmative action or other government programs, do more harm than good. I found this chapter particularly disingenuous, and I know Sowell fans are going to hate hearing that, but it's true. I think this chapter really goes out on some statistical limbs by bringing up outliers and corner cases and inferring some massively scoped conclusions. He uses one anecdotal piece of evidence, the story of Dunbar High School, to suggest that racial desegregation was pointless and counterproductive, while, as Professor Doliak writes, Quote, in fact, there is substantial research evidence that desegregation efforts, including busing, improved long term outcomes for black students, unquote. Sowell is no fool and he's no liar. He makes some excellent points in this chapter, and to his credit, he concedes a number of points that I hadn't expected him to. But cherry picking outliers like that is disingenuous, and he absolutely knows it. Sowell's classism is also prevalent in Chapter 3, from his views on the minimum wage to charter schools. He also provides a number of anecdotes essentially saying that certain aspects of black culture are more responsible for bad socioeconomic outcomes than racism or discrimination. Quote, there was a time when ordinary blacks saw clearly that the misbehavior of a black underclass would cause other blacks to be burdened with a backlash. Unquote. Sowell is happy to acknowledge and discuss nuance to no end when it serves his agenda, but is just as happy to give a handful of outlier examples and call it a day when that same anti regulatory bootstraps agenda calls for it. Oh, and let me say that I totally empathize with people who want to highlight and target crime and violence within black communities. Obviously, like super obviously. I happen to think it's entirely reasonable to demand that we address systemic and historic inequality as well as those immediate concerns. Moving on. Chapter 4, The World of Numbers. This chapter is well researched and thorough, just like the previous three, but it's very deceptive as well. It's all about how statistics can be molded, interpreted, propagandized, and manipulated. Here, Sowell seeks to teach his readers about statistical dishonesty while engaging in precisely the kind of dishonesty he's warning about. His examples are well worth the read, they're thought provoking and properly documented, but he so carefully curates these examples as to make his agenda almost unbearably pronounced. Here, even more so than in previous chapters, it's Sowell's classism that speaks loudest to me, as he rails on about income inequality being overblown, high taxes on the rich, abolishing the minimum wage, and continues to claim that bad behavior among poor black people remains the biggest factor in their socioeconomic struggles because, as Sowell puts it, quote, in trying to determine the reasons for economic and social disparities between blacks and whites, some observers attribute these differences primarily to policies and practices by people outside the black community, while other observers attribute these same differences to internal differences in behavior between black and white Americans, unquote. It seems clear that Sowell counts himself among the latter group. All in all, not a chapter where Sowell and I find much agreement. Okay, on to chapter 5 and then straight into my conclusion and final thoughts. The final chapter of the book, Social Visions and Human Consequences, opens with a disingenuous disclaimer that Sowell's examples and rhetoric aren't meant to provide solutions, when in fact he's been doing so the entire time and not entirely subtly. Abolish the minimum wage, end affirmative action in all forms, reduce taxes on the wealthy, let the free market dictate equality of opportunity, and let people of all races pull themselves up by their bootstraps and succeed on their own merits. It's not an entirely unattractive mindset. It's easy to see why it's such an easy sell for people, particularly those of us in the middle class with just enough to lose that we feel protective of it. But someone with his intellectual horsepower should have a more pragmatic approach than to simply assume the only solution is the free hand of a ruthless market. He's too smart to ignore that inequality exists, and to his credit, he doesn't try. He simply refuses to acknowledge any evidence that such inequality can be positively affected by outside influences like social welfare programs. Content to no longer mince words about his stance, Sowell writes, quote, at the heart of many discussions of disparities among individuals, groups, and nations is the seemingly invincible fallacy that outcomes in human endeavors would be equal or at least comparable or random if there were no biased interventions on the one hand, nor genetic deficiencies on the other. This preconception, which spans the ideological spectrum, is in utter defiance of both logic and empirical evidence from around the world and over millennia of recorded history. This is insultingly misleading and downright wrong, in my opinion. And I hope people aren't simply taken in by the avalanche of information he provides throughout the book because, despite there being some very impressive, thought provoking elements to it, it's a far cry from an ironclad refutation of the idea that equal opportunities lead to comparably more equal outcomes. He's so boldly disingenuous in this chapter as to relate the dispersion of weather events throughout the world to the variability of socioeconomic outcomes among demographic groups, such as, quote, even such natural phenomena as earthquakes, lightning, and tornadoes likewise show highly skewed distributions around the world. Nevertheless, an implicit assumption persists that equal or at least comparable outcomes would exist among different groups of people except for adverse interventions. Yeah, that's right, because half of all the geysers in the world are in Yellowstone National Park. Racial integration and affirmative action are useless at best. If that sounds a bit silly, it's because it definitely is. Chapter 5 is definitely Sowell's most agenda laden of all, corresponding to chapters 6 and 7 in the revised edition, and bringing the book to a close, which brings us to my final thoughts. Look, at the end of the day, there's plenty that I can agree with Sowell on, despite how angry he makes me. So, before I wrap up with my final criticisms, let's go through what I really like about discrimination and disparities. I'm going to do my best to step outside my criticisms and just focus on the good stuff here. First of all, I love data, and so does Thomas Sowell, so we're good there. He knows way more information than I ever will, and I'm sure of that. Bring me all the stats, bring me the numbers and the surveys and the trends, the peer reviewed studies, all of it. I love that. I feel like I could spend a whole day just looking at and arguing over data with Sowell, trying to gain the upper hand in a debate over some social policy. So when he insists that we should take a hard, fact based look at each and every social program we consider, I wholeheartedly agree. And I'll grant him that we have and most certainly will continue to fall short of perfection on that front. He's also not wrong about politics and bureaucracy getting in the way. The cycle of elections and the fickleness of voters make the establishment and maintenance of social programs especially difficult. I also, of course, appreciate many of the same values that Soul focuses on throughout the book, values like self discipline and hard work. He rightly points out that we have a responsibility to look beyond our emotional inclinations and be willing to adjust or even reverse course when presented with irrefutable evidence that a certain policy is not working as intended. In short, Soul and I can definitely agree on his assertion that, quote, intentions, whether good or bad, do not predestine outcomes, unquote. I've said it before, and now one more time. He's a very intelligent man, and this book is further proof of that. The bibliography alone on this thing is quite impressive. But okay, now things get less positive. If Soul's intention were merely to educate people on the nuanced complexities of discrimination and the conflicting data regarding the efficacy of certain specific social programs, I'd like the book. But he so obviously weaves his agenda through it by doing exactly the kind of data manipulation he assails so vehemently in Chapter 4 that I spent a good deal of time just rolling my eyes. Thomas Sowell is an exceedingly high performer, and his manner of social theories is not entirely unexpected from someone in his position, but I can't excuse it either. It's the old, why can't you get your shit together? I did. Why aren't you working harder and smarter? I did. Why aren't you speaking English properly? I do. And look, I get it, I do, but we're talking about macro level change to the population at large, not some tough love mentorship we might give our niece or nephew. You can't just demand that a culture change on its own when so much of what he would classify as negative behavior is driven by the very socioeconomic challenges we're looking to address through the social programs he hates so much because they don't have immediate perfect impact. See, the difference between Soul and I comes down to my belief in the maxim that, as Voltaire once put it, perfect is the enemy of good, and that government regulation and intervention are not only beneficial, but necessary to facilitate the best solutions available. Are we going to hit home runs every time? Nope. Are all the complicating factors we've discussed going to continue to make large scale social programs incredibly difficult to build and manage? Yep. So you apply the best and brightest minds in society to tackling such problems, and we do the best that we can. Remember, just because you personally are a high performer and were able to rise above your modest beginnings doesn't mean you should immediately seize the opportunity to look down upon those who might not perform at that same level or find good fortune in the same way. Maybe they need an extra hand to become the best citizen they can be, and that's all okay too. And just because we understand that concepts and programs like affirmative action will never be perfect, will always require re examination and redirection, constant empirical analysis, etc. Doesn't mean the entire concept is worthless and we shouldn't pursue it. Of course, any program targeting socioeconomic empowerment for millions of individuals is going to be so complex as to guarantee that it'll never be perfect. But the answer is not to simply throw up our hands and say, oh, well, let's let the free hand of the market run amok. Consequences to the lower classes be damned. All in all, I'm glad I read the book, but I am wary of recommending it to anyone who's not already pretty well versed in this kind of rhetoric and data analysis, because otherwise it'd be very easy to get overwhelmed. And he spends so much of the book arguing with an imagined straw man, some naive idealist who doesn't understand the complexities of real life, that a casual reader might be fooled into thinking that actual grown ass progressives think this way, which just further divides us by playing into existing political prejudices. Okay, I could keep rambling like this all day, so let me wrap this up. Folks, if you've stuck with me this long, I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this content and want to see more, please leave a like on the video. Leave me some thoughts and feedback. Leave me your suggestions in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. You'll make my day. Thanks again for coming by. I hope I see y'all again soon. Peace out.